Good evening and thank you for making time to join us on this week's edition of Sunday Interview. I'm your host, Grevazio Zulu. Now, digital migration is arguably one of the biggest international projects in the broadcasting and telecommunications industry in the last 10 years. African governments, Zambia included, have spent billions of dollars on the purchase of equipment that will help the country migrate by the international set deadline of June 2015. In many nations where the migration has or is still taking place, multinational companies with headquarters in the Western world or in Asia have taken up the contracts. And many are now asking, is this project worthwhile? Or it's just one of those brought up by the developed nations to enrich themselves and drain more resources from the poor and dependent nations? What are the benefits of digital migration? Join me as I speak to a media expert of international repute, Phil Molefe. Phil is the executive chair of the Africa Media Institute. He has also held several positions in broadcasting associations, including UTNA, the African Union of Broadcasting, and the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association. He has also served as chief executive officer of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, Z.N.B.C. Phil, welcome to the interview.
Thank you. Good evening, and good evening to your viewers.
And welcome to Zambia.
Thank you so much. Zambia has been very good to me.
I guess you've had a nice tour and enjoyed the weather.
Absolutely. The weather has been good, but as you know, Zambia is a second home to most South Africans. So I am home.
Now, digital migration, is it worth it?
Yes, it is worth it. And before we could look at the benefits and the challenges of digital migration, I think it is important to first explain what is digital migration. DTT, as it is called, is digital terrestrial television. What it means is it is the evolution of broadcasting television technology from analog to digital. So we are now witnessing the migration of the broadcasting technology from the old format to the new one. What was the old format? Analog occupied a large spectrum space, which means for one television channel, you would require a very large spectrum. Now with digital technology, television, actually the spectrum has been reduced, freeing up space for more channels. In the place of one channel, you can have 10 channels. So we are moving into a multi-channel broadcast environment. The second thing about DTT is DTT will allow for a better and clearer picture quality. DTT also allows interactivity. So your viewers do not only become passive consumers of products. Viewers can also interact, can also participate in a program. So there are more benefits than challenges in the DTT broadcast environment.
When you talk of interaction, viewers being more interactive, isn't this happening even in the analog world?
Well, it is happening, but with limitations and constraints. DTT, you can pause a program, move to another channel, and then pick up, and then tweet, do Facebook, and all those things, and actually, in fact, pose questions. Like we're in a studio discussion, a viewer out there can also participate in the program far more effectively than we currently do.
As we roll out DTT, the digital migration, as nations migrate, I want you to look at the opportunities that are being created. This is being seen as, well, a big project, quite all right, but the benefits are not trickling down to people, the ordinary citizens. It's well, the multinational companies coming up, picking up these tenders, picking up the contracts, and well, off they go. You've migrated, quite all right.
Well, I think we were still at the growth phase, and we see technology really leading the whole process. But it is not just a technology thing. It is also not just about multinationals coming in. This was the early stages and the investment phase. But as we move on, the benefits will begin to emerge. And the benefits are the availability of more spectrum, more television channels. So Z.N.B.C, for example, you currently have 2 channels. But in the DTT space, Z.N.B.C will have 10 to 15 television channels. What do multiple channels mean? It means there is more available platforms to tell the Zambian story and indeed the African story. I can see currently with 2 channels that you have serious space constraints. You cannot tell stories or documentaries of developments in the rural areas in the provinces because you only have 2 channels. When you have multiple channels, you can have 1 channel for news, 24 hours, 1 channel for sports, 1 channel for entertainment and education, and 1 channel for indigenous affairs, which means the rural people will begin to see themselves on television. And that, to me, is the most important benefit of DTT.
Now, let's look at digital migration and the time frame, really. This thing was known probably 10 years ago that
Yes.
would embark on this journey of migrating. Now, what we are seeing is so many countries, particularly in the SADC region, or in Africa, if you may wish to say, panicking.
Oh, yes.
There's only a year remaining. In June, we should be remaining with 12 months to the deadline. What really happened?
Oh, yes, there's panic, and I suppose part of it is human nature. When the decision was taken in Geneva, Switzerland, at the ITU, the International Telecommunication Conference, that the world must now move into the digital space, I think human nature, among other things, was to say, oh, well, we still have time, and you leave things to the last moment. And now this is the last moment upon us, we are panicking. But secondly, and most importantly, I think is because broadcasters and indeed governments thought this whole thing is about technology only. And the whole process was left to technocrats and to technology people to look at what standards must be applied, what formats must be used. So the greater part of this 10-year preparatory period was taken up by technology discussions. What standards do we apply? Is it DVB-T2 or DVB-T1 or ISDB and all that thing? And viewers, in fact, are not interested in standards. Viewers want to see a product, a program on air. So the greater part of this preparatory period was taken up by technology. Now I think that we have put that to bed. We need to really focus on the substantive issues. And these are issues of content, issues of capacity building, and issues of leadership. Content is important because if Z.N.B.C wakes up to a day where it now has 15 channels, we must address the question of content. Where is content going to come from? And you cannot just go about scavenging and collecting anything that you come across. It must be quality and compelling programming. So I think there has been a delay which was largely taken up by discussions around the technology, standards, and formats that were to be applied.
I know we'll take a bit of time on the content issue, but I want to ask you one thing. Are you to blame, really? You failed to advise, probably failed to advise government that this issue was not only a technical issue, you, as a leadership in the broadcasting industry at that particular moment.
Well, in all honesty, yes, we must take some of the blame, but also it is a question of how the whole process evolved. The deadlines were tight, and we thought a 10-year period. You look at it and you think it's a long way off, and it really wasn't. So yes, I think the broadcasting leadership must take the fair share of the blame, but there is also the question of governments. And here I'm not talking about Zambia, Botswana, South Africa. I'm just talking about governments across the region. I think there were delays also on the part of governments to decide which way should we be going. Because broadcasters can only make presentations and recommendations to governments. But then governments must decide on standards, on the technologies to be used, and governments must also make capital expenditure and funds available.
In this case, you didn't give the recommendations.
Well, I think in some cases the broadcasters did put forward the recommendations to governments, because as broadcasters we meet in our regional and continental bodies. The Southern African region had agreed that we will employ a uniform format because there is a great deal of consensus in Southern Africa, something that is lamentably absent in other regions of the continent. In Southern Africa, we tend to move in unison. So as broadcasters, we had agreed that we would go the DVB-T standard, and we presented that to our governments. And I think that is where the ball was dropped. The delay in deciding, supporting, and financing the project.
But we're seeing a bit of that consensus being broken now, with other countries opting for a European format, while others are opting for the Japanese format.
Well, I think in Southern Africa, we have only one country that is going ISDB, which is Japanese. The rest of SADC, I think we have now stayed on DVB-T2. That includes Angola. There was, of course, some delays. Angola had at some stage went the Brazilian way. South Africa had also pulled out of the DVB-T2 process and tried to look at other possibilities, the Japanese standard or the Brazil standard. That delayed the whole process. But around 2011, South Africa came back and rejoined the DVB-T2 standard process. And now, as we speak, the rest of the Southern African region, with the exception of one country, is on DVB-T2.
And we still don't seem to be ready, despite all coming back and agreeing. There are very few countries that have migrated, and later on, even beaten the SADC deadline of 2013, December.
Yes.
Almost all the countries almost missed it.
Almost all missed it, but there are countries that met the deadline. Tanzania met the deadline. Namibia met the deadline. Mauritius met the deadline. And of course, the rest, it means the opposite is true. They have not met the deadline.
Which means a lot of the bulk of the nations have not met the deadline.
The bulk of the nations have not met the SADC deadline.
SADC deadline.
We still have the international deadline, which is June of 2015.
And a number of countries, some of them are still on tender stage. Is there a risk that a huge population will be left out?
There is a risk because, remember, this deadline means the analog signal is going to be switched off. So we need to work very, very hard. We need to work even at an accelerated pace to make sure that we move as swiftly as possible to launch DTT. And this is part of the work I'm doing around the Southern African region to provide support to broadcasters to get DTT ready. It's about ensuring that all of us are DTT ready, and when the deadline comes, we are in.
The impression I get is that even though a number of countries may make it, the crossover will still be very chaotic.
Yes, it's becoming rather messy now because there's panic and we now desperate, and sometimes it's not a good situation to manage a transition. But I think a great deal of progress has been made. From the recent trips that I have done around the Southern African states, I think now we are moving forward with far more greater pace. So I am quite confident that we will meet the June 2015 deadline.
All the nations?
All the nations, of course, there will be some exceptions, but I think all the nations. There had been concern about Zambia. Zambia had actually been one area that a great deal of concern had been expressed. But for the time that I have spent here and the amount of work that is being allocated to get this whole process underway, I think we'll be able to make it by, the scruff of the neck. But we will make it. We just need to accelerate the pace. We need to have very clear project lines, target dates, deliverables, and the desired outcomes. I think that's what we need to do in Zambia, because Zambia is an important part of the Southern African region, and it cannot be left out. And it's good that Zambia is also on the DVB-T2 standard. So I think we should be pulling together in the same direction.
We hear South Africa is also in the same boat.
Oh, yes.
With fears that you may miss the deadline.
Oh, yes. But remember, South Africa had launched around 2007, and we even went on to dual illumination. Dual illumination is when you test the two signals, the analog and the digital signals. So South Africa did go through that period where there was both the analog broadcast and the digital broadcast. So a great deal of ground was covered in South Africa. There was, however, that temporary suspension of the process when now South Africa wanted to look at other systems in Japan, in Brazil, and there was also China knocking at the door. So in a way that almost derailed the process. But South Africa is now back on track, and I think weighing on the benefits it had derived from the previous experience, South Africa should be able to move fairly rapidly.
For the public out there, for the ordinary citizens, and not the, maybe not for the governments, the issues about set-top boxes, and many nations have not resolved on how they're going to have this distributed, or are they going to be subsidized, and probably this is also delaying the decision point in trying to migrate.
Yes, I think that is the major sticking point now, the set-top boxes, because you need a set-top boxes which is a technological device that accesses the signal, the new digital signal. So every household will need a set-top box. Now, considering the inequalities, particularly in African societies, we have some very rich people and extremely poor people. Now, governments will have to really address that situation, because this is a situation that is ubiquitous throughout the African continent. So governments will have to really address that situation, that what do we do with very, very poor households? Some countries have provided subsidies for very, very poor households. In television language, you divide these into living standard measures, LSMs 1 to 4, LSMs 5 to 7, LSMs 8 to 10, and LSMs 10 to 12. The living standard measures would then define the economic muscle of a household. So I think even in Zambia, that is one area that will require careful consideration. How do we make set-top boxes available to very poor households? And then, of course, those who can afford and who live just on the bread line or above, then they should find, a means of buying themselves set-top boxes.
Looking at this situation, you're still confident we're ready to migrate and meet the deadline?
I think so, because remember, African states, most of them are developmental states. And a developmental state is where government intervenes to support the poor. So when you have governments that operate on the basis of a developmental state, I think it is very possible that the question of poor households will be addressed. If you were in Europe or other, societies, that's where, where it is the rule of every man to himself. I don't think that is the rule of the game in African societies. So once we can address the question of extremely poor households, I think we'll be out of the hole, and the whole process will be on track.
So the risk is very, very real. That
The
the greater
risk is
part
real.
of a population
Oh,
will be
yes.
cut off if we hastily migrate,
Well, we
which we
need-
are doing as
Oh,
SADC.
yes. Oh, yes. But you see, the issues are now coming to the fore. Now they need to be addressed. Governments and broadcasters must be proactive, and we must confront the issues head on. So if these issues of inequalities in society are addressed now, we don't have to delay. We've already missed the December 2013 deadline if we move with speed. So I think now the challenge is up to governments and broadcasters to address this issue of poor households. And unfortunately, they form the bulk of the population. So if we can address that one, it's a real risk, then I think we'll be out of the woods.
Let's get back to content. You have all these channels created, availability made to national broadcasters and private broadcasters, I must say, 10, 15 channels, and you cannot fill them. No content at all.
Oh, yes.
This is a big problem.
It's a major challenge and a major risk. One that when I addressed one of the international conferences recently, I said DTT is doomed to fail in Africa unless we address the question of content. Content, I use this illustration. You know, in South Africa, you have the largest man-made hole. This is where diamond was, were mined in Africa, in South Africa, in Kimberley. You have what we call the Kimberley hole. It's a very large hole. You can see it from the plane when you are flying to Cape Town. It's so large, it's huge. And I was using this analogy that DTT is like attempting to fill the Kimberley hole with a spoon. You will do so for the whole with a teaspoon or even a spoon. Even a spade will still not get you anywhere. So DTT is a large beast and one that forages for itself. It must be fed. So content is a major challenge. In fact, it poses a serious risk to African broadcasting because with DTT, now you are going to have multiple channels. Z.N.B.C, for example, will have about 10 to 15 channels. What is going to sit on those channels? If you don't plan now, and if you don't come out with proactive strategies, most of those channels are going to become white elephants. And as they say in nature, nature does not allow a vacuum. So if Z.N.B.C cannot fill those channels, someone will. And when they do so, they will do so on their own terms. So China, India, Russia, all the foreign networks will come in and dump their unused content on the African airwaves. And I think that is what will spell a disaster for African broadcasting.
So how can this be addressed?
Well,
so it's already a disaster, really, because a lot of these nations, public broadcasters, are heavily dependent on government.
Yes.
And government, in relation to addressing many other poverty issues, broadcasting is not a priority.
Yes.
In many of these SADC nations.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why I established the Africa Media Institute when I left the corporate world. Having realized the challenges and the risks that African broadcasting, face, that if we don't address the content challenges now, we are actually an endangered species. African broadcasting, Z.N.B.C included, is an endangered species because foreign networks are going to come in and drown us out, and we will disappear in our own space.
Do we have an option?
No, yes, we can proactively.
Rushing to migrate, rushing to do the tender issues, and now rushing to have the local content.
Yes, we do have an option, and that is why I'm going around the region. I'm saying to the broadcasters, let us now develop very clear and proactive content strategies. We must create. Africa has lots of content. You go to Kitwe, you go to Ndola, you go to Livingston. There's so much content about Zambia that we hardly ever see. So now we must go and train people on the ground. So it's a question of skills development, and which is also a good thing for a country, that we can go out to the rural areas, identify those youngsters who aspire to become television producers. This is an opportunity. So I look at the flip side. To me, a challenge is actually the opposite of an opportunity. So I look at the flip side of things. So there is an opportunity there to unearth talent in Africa. And when we have unearthed that talent, we can begin to tell our stories right across Zambia. The beauty of DTT is once up and running, Zambia will be able to be reflected to Zambians across the spectrum. That is the beauty of DTT. I don't think we should I don't think we should be daunted and be intimidated by this new development and really be scared. I think we should move forward with confidence and say, now is the time that we must create more content, and there's so much content in Africa that can be created. Two, we must train and train people on the ground, people who otherwise would not have had access to broadcasting. We must train. But at the higher level, we must develop a new cadre of leaders who can manage or who will manage the new broadcasting environment, which will inevitably require a new business model.
So we're still getting back to the same thing, training, having more local content, more production houses, and it all calls for resources. Do the nations have the resources?
Well, I think alongside that is the opportunity that, and which I have seen most countries, embarking on that process. We are making the television signal available to rural areas through universal access. And I think we're beginning to win that battle. More transmitters are being launched in the rural areas to reach those people. So that same strategy of reaching out to rural communities is the same strategy that must be used to reach out now to the local people who must tell the stories. Remember, content is about telling your story. Now tell me if a person in Kitwe cannot tell his or her story. Many of the people there will be able to tell their story, and that is content. Many people in Kitwe, in other regions, have cultural festivals, cultural events that they hold from time to time. This is actually content, because we would like to see the country reflected to the rest of the people in that country. So I think this is something that can be addressed. This is a battle that can be won. We just need to go out there and do the work. Someone has to dirty his hands. Someone must put shoulder to the wheel to make sure that it happens. And like I say, we are beginning to win the battle with universal access. That same strategy must be employed to take even expertise to the rural areas.
Now we're looking at even bigger economies in bigger countries like South Africa failing to meet their own targets. So is it 45% local content?
No. Local content has really improved in South Africa. So much that the Z.N.B.C, I think, is in the region of about 70% of local content. Remember that South Africa now has even become the exporter of its local content. Soapies like Generations, Movango, and so on are exported right across the continent. And that is actually the beauty of that investment.
So there are lessons to be learned from South Africa.
Oh yes. South Africa invested in that. And South Africa then, through the public broadcaster, invested in production houses so that you create. Effectively, it must become a program of government and the national public broadcaster to support community media, to support small local production houses. When they grow, it is to the benefit of the country, because those small production houses, once they are fully developed, you start exporting Zambian content. So you may be sitting somewhere in Lagos, Nigeria, and you will see Zambian documentaries. I think that is the way to go. Sometimes we get daunted by the magnitude of the task and we think this mountain is insurmountable and we walk away from it. No, we must confront it and we can really go over it. And once we have won that battle, Zambia will become an exporter of television content. And that's what you need.
So your push is for local content, but there's, on the other side, there's an argument, well, foreign content is cheap. There are a lot of movies out there in India, in Mexico that are cheap.
Oh,
why
yes.
not go for them? If you can get a free thing, why spend money?
It's a balancing act. It's a balancing act. Local content, that must be your greater emphasis, and then foreign content. Of course, we live in a global village. You don't want Zambians only to know about Zambia. They should know about Zimbabwe, Malawi, Angola, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and even countries to the north, and indeed outside the continent. So foreign content, I'm not shooting that down. But what I'm saying is we need to reflect ourselves first. We need to tell our stories. And when I say local content, I broaden that notion to include the region so that Zambia can also begin to see what is happening across the borders. You need to really begin to appreciate even those areas where there are synergies in your culture. You may think things that you are doing as cultural events are uniquely Zambian, but as you travel along, you find that the same is replicated in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. You then begin to realize that we are one people. So that is local content. So my local content is not in the narrow sense of Zambia for Zambian content, but it must be Zambia and then broadened even further to include the region. And then foreign content should be what we buy over the counter in film festivals, which we also need. You cannot do without it. But let's work on a model of 70% local, 30% foreign. It's a balancing act.
I want you to address two issues here. There's one, the business model. In so many of these countries, the economy is very small. So you have basically same advertisers on a number of these channels. And then you have so many channels. We're basically saying these other channels will be running probably with no adverts. And where do they get the money?
No, I think first and foremost, broadcasters must get their business model right. Most broadcasters in Africa, in fact, are operating this thing like a corner shop. You know, one that is set up to sell sweets and ginger cakes to kids when they come back from school. And what do I mean by that? You need a very clear and solid business model. A model that is very clear on issues of schedule stability. Now, you find that in Africa, we are not committed to schedule stability. Your schedule changes every day, and sometimes even halfway through the day. You pull out this program, you put another one. That is upsetting the market. But the second one is the lamentable absence of market research and market intelligence. You cannot run a business of this size without a proper market research and market intelligence. Market research is going out to the audiences and say, what do you want to see? Sometimes we broadcasters were arrogant. We think we can decide for the people, and we think we know better what is good for them. No, we're dealing with intelligent people. Some of them may not have been to university, but they are very intelligent. So we must respect our audiences. Market research is an instrument that helps us to understand the needs and expectations of our audiences. The third one is an environment that allows for vibrancy, that allows for real, interaction and all that, where there is input from society and the broadcaster is the reflection of the aspirations of the nation. And you do that through town hall broadcasts. To me, broadcasting must not be confined to our studios here in Lusaka. You must actually be on the road through your programs, and you must be seen to be there. So what I'm saying is you need a business model that is solid and supported by how you run your business, your schedule, your market research, your market intelligence, your interactivity with audiences, and the basic tenets of media practices. You must also observe those basic tenets. So broadcasting must not be treated as an afterthought type of business. And that is why most broadcasting organizations are poor. There is no justification for a broadcasting organization to be poor when you are actually commanding wielding such a great influence in society. In South Africa, for example, the SABC is arguably the most influential organization after government. So if after government you are the most powerful institution in a country, then how do you become, bankrupt and economically, challenged? You can't be, because you have all the audiences watching your programs. So I think the problem there is proper business models that will ensure viability and sustainability.
So you're looking at digital migration as evolution or a revolution?
It's an evolution as far as the technological process is concerned, but it is a revolution for the broadcasting industry. It's a revolution. We're going to wake up to a new world where, Zambians will have a choice. Viewers are spoiled for choice. And remember, viewers are very intelligent. They will vote with their feet and move next door and watch other channels. So we must be prepared for that revolution.
How do we now bring in an issue of actually developing very effective and efficient public broadcasting stations and services?
Well,
of course, there's taking into consideration the issues of interference. This is very common in African countries.
Well, public service broadcasting must lead even this digital process. Of course, government makes the decisions, allocates the funds, and creates the regulatory environment and allocates the multiplexes, who is going to get how many channels. But the national public broadcaster should then lead this process in terms of public education. The masses out there must be educated about what is DTT, what is set-top box, what will happen to my old TV set, what is going to happen to the signal that I am currently receiving. But public broadcaster should also lead the process in developing local talent. Public broadcaster must lead the way in developing community media and small production houses that will feed content to the public broadcaster. And of course, you can give the surplus to commercial private stations. Private stations, experience has shown, they normally go for foreign content that is bought over the counter. So there is really no interest in developing local talent. So public broadcaster is very central to this revolution and must lead the way in ensuring that we take everyone on board and we develop talent and we export expertise to areas where broadcasting was almost absent.
I want to take you maybe first the football rights, the issue of football rights. Let's look at the procurement of these rights. This is an area where African countries are ripped off.
Oh yes, that's true.
Swindled, if that's the correct word to use.
Oh yes.
You're paying billions and billions and millions of dollars.
Oh yes, no, that is true. Our position gets weakened when we engage the rights holders as individual broadcasting organizations, as individual countries. In the African Union of Broadcasting, we were pushing for a position where Africa can secure these rights as a bloc, because the amount demanded by the rights holders is just prohibitively expensive. Take soccer rights. You get 90%, they are sold in packages. You cannot say, like it's World Cup now in Brazil, I want the World Cup, but because I'm Z.N.B.C, I want World Cup only where the Zambia national team is featured. No, no, no. It's a package. Must get a package, and that will include Uruguay playing someone else who you may probably not have an interest in. But even beyond that, the package will also include things like beach football. It's all loaded there. So it is 90% of all that stuff that may not be appealing to your viewers, topped with a little layer, 10% of cream, which is what you are looking for. But you have to pay for all that. It is offloaded onto your stations. And the fees are very high. So much that in 2011, at the African Union General Assembly that was held in Ghana, I moved a proposal that the Directors General of Broadcasting must make representations to their governments. And we ask our governments through the African Union to engage, you know, the Confederation of African Football and FIFA, and say, you know, what is charged to our broadcasters is beyond means. I mean, the fees are unsustainable.
But this didn't work, did it?
Well,
we're still being lumped with these huge figures. I know you had a similar experience working as Z.N.B.C chief executive. You have this experience.
Oh yes, we had that experience. I mean, in 2011, as chief executive of the Z.N.B.C, we missed some of the games that involved the national team. I remember South Africa was going to play Niger. These were the qualifiers. And we couldn't broadcast that game because the license holders were demanding 5 million rands for a match, which is about $1 million. But I think the rate at the time was 500,000 US, which is still exorbitant. And we looked at the number of qualifiers, and I said, this does not make business sense. Does it mean every soccer match I am going to pay 5 million rand, 2 weeks later 5 million rand, and so on and so forth? I mean, I would blow the budget of the organization just for football. And football is not the only business of the Z.N.B.C. I must also broadcast programs on health, on education. There are competing interests. So it was a big problem for us. And until, you know, the Minister of Sports was engaged and we were able to have meetings with the license holders, and we negotiated a difficult battle. So this is something that remains to be addressed.
How can it be addressed? How should it be addressed?
Look, I think at the multilateral fora, such as SABA and the AUB, but also going through our governments, but them not as individuals, through something like an AU summit resolution. You know, because I remember in Ghana 2011, at the meeting of DGs, I had moved that, in fact, we should send a delegation, an African Union delegation, to the AU summit in Addis Ababa and make a presentation to our heads of state where we say, we are being milked to a point of bleeding. Can you, as the summit, make, you know, an impassioned plea to the Confederation of African Football and FIFA, so that we look at the whole pricing structure, and it needs to be revised, because I think poorer countries are milked, and it's a point of really inexplicable figures. I don't know how these are arrived at. But I think also taking advantage of the passion and interest in football in African societies. So this matter really needs to be addressed through the African Union, our heads of state, to engage those bodies, because I think it's a David and Goliath. And as broadcasters, we are minnows in the scheme of things. So perhaps if we go through the AU structure, while we also back them and form part of that delegation and say, can we work out? Because I have continuously asked, how do we arrive at some of the figures that are determined by these guys? I mean, 18 million euros. That translates into hundreds of millions of an African currency. So I think this matter must be pursued with a vigor.
With vigor it deserves. But before we leave the issue of soccer, you know, Zambia is in mourning. We just lost one of our best commentators, Dennis Liwewe. What impact did he have in South Africa? I know he had.
Oh, yes. No, I mean, Dennis Liwewe had an impact on the whole continent. In South Africa, I mean, he was loved dearly because the Z.N.B.C, we also have Channel Africa, which broadcasts across the continent. And sometimes he would be interviewed and talk to our listeners on that platform. But also, I mean, he's been to South Africa on a number of visits when Zambia is playing there. So he had an impact, so much that I remember one time, I think it was the Africa Cup of Nations when he came, and he insisted that, you know, he must be given a booth because Zambia is playing and is attracting such a large audience. He needs a booth so that, you know, the Zambian is accorded the respect it deserves. And I said, I think Dennis is the 12th player of the Zambian national squad. You've got 11 players on the field, and he was the 12th one playing from the sidelines. So our deepest sympathy and condolences to the family, and indeed the people of Zambia over the loss of Dennis Liwewe, who had made such an impact on the broadcast of football in Zambia, in the region, and across the continent.
I'll give you a minute. I know you're a broadcaster. You probably may not stick to it, but I want you to stick to a minute to talk about African Media Institute.
Well,
what is it about and what are you doing?
The Africa Media Institute is a dynamic Pan-African project to provide support and assistance to broadcasters in the initial phase to get DTT ready. But our vision goes beyond DTT. But we provide support in the area of skills development, capacity building, and leadership or management development. Leadership or management development, that's where we assist broadcasters to develop new business models that will be applicable to this changing broadcasting environment. And beyond that, we also look at issues of turnaround strategy for broadcasting organizations. As you can see from my CV, I have done broadcasting from left to right, top to bottom, and I have a very clear understanding of where broadcasting is and what is the African broadcasting landscape as we speak now on the eve of DTT.
Phil, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, you've been watching Sunday Interview, and our guest today was Phil Molefe, a seasoned and veteran journalist and broadcaster with over 35 years of experience. He is currently serving as executive chairperson of the African Media Institute. Till next week at the same time, pleasant viewing.